Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on responding to insurrection. How do we talk to students? I'm Hiller Spires. I'm Executive Director at the Friday Institute and Associate Dean in the College of Education at North Carolina State University. First, I want us to recognize that this is indeed a challenging time in our nation. And the topic that we're going to engage in today is indeed a challenging topic. But we know as educators, we cannot avoid these conversations. Like many of you, I witnessed as our Capitol was besieged last week. As a white, cisgendered woman in higher education, I recognize that I'm on a very long journey trying to unlearn, listen, disrupt, and reimagine our world. Today's important discussion is yet another step in my own professional and personal journey. I look forward to learning with you. Second, in our audience today, there are teachers, principals, counselors, and many other educators who are joining us. Some of us work with young learners, some of us work with older learners, and even adults. No matter what our context is, we all have the same obligation, that is to uphold a democratic education, to engage learners in critical thinking and conversations, and to prepare them as contributors to a healthy, inclusive society. We're witnessing in real time how fragile democracy can be and that it needs to be nurtured and defended. Today, we have a very exciting panel of educators with us who will help us explore how we can talk with students through major moments of uncertainty. Specifically, the context for this conversation is the act of insurrection on our Capitol last week and the continued conflict that we're experiencing as a nation. So joining us today, we have Dr. Tricia Townsend. She is the Director of Federal Programs and Monitoring at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Welcome, Tricia.
Thank you for having me today.
Next, we have Angela Kuzak. She's assistant principal intern at L.B. Yancey and Pinkston Street Elementary in Vance County. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Next, Marlon Jones. He's a social studies teacher at Broughton High School here in Wake County. Welcome, Marlon.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And finally, Dr. Megan Manfra. She's an associate professor of social studies in the College of Education at North Carolina State University. Thank you all for being with us today. You're taking your time. You're going to share your insights and your experiences. And our goal is to have an engaging conversation so that we can hopefully provide support for other educators as they are grappling with this difficult time in our history. We're going to have each of our panelists speak for about 5 minutes and provide some introductory comments. And then we'll have a dialogue across participants and open up the chat feature so that the audience can provide questions as well. So here we go. We're going to start with Dr. Townsend. Tricia, you are in a very important role at the Department of Public Instruction. You work with policy at the state and federal levels. You're also a parent of a high school student. And I'd like for you to start us off by talking a little bit about what you're experiencing now in both of those roles.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I am really elated to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity to share. As Hiller stated, my view is really twofold. In my current work, our goal is to push out $2.6 billion in federal funds to support students. That's any and all students. And so that could be those attending low performing schools, those who get free and reduced lunch, ESL students, homeless, foster, those in penal institutions, migrant students. we want to make sure that we support all students across the state. And I think in this line of business, I really have to say that it's very important that we understand that each student comes to us with a different background, a different experience. And as educators, we really have to make sure that we lift up those different experiences. Also, as a mom to a 9th grade boy who has been engaged in remote learning since March. And so his way of communicating with others, how he's experiencing school is far different than he's ever experienced. And so I wear the hat of advocating for all students, but then I also have to advocate for my boy. I think we all agree that the incident last week was a really ugly mark on the history of this country. How you view the incident may vary. However, we have to really stop to say what happened cannot happen again. We have to make sure that we help students engage in discourse so that they understand how to really express their thoughts and feelings and work within legal means if there are issues or concerns that they have. I think as I think about this situation, I need to say that adults are working to make sense of what happened. We are discussing it with our families. We're discussing it with our friends and our coworkers. Just as we're doing that, students are watching us make sense of it. They're making sense of what happened as well. They're discussing it with their friends, and if allowed, they are discussing it within their schools with their teachers and peers. I firmly believe that they really want assurances from us that everything is going to work out. They are verbally expressing their thoughts as well as posting much of that on social media platforms like Instagram or TikTok or Twitter. Probably not Facebook, because my children tell me that's only for old people. Being a mom, I'm a super snooper. I look, I monitor, and I will say on the day of the event, I noticed that my son posted a Snapchat message. He'd taken a nap after his classes had ended for the day. He was shocked when he woke up. His post was an image of him outside. It showed his green Crocs, and he said, I wake up from a nap and the US is in shambles. I can't take naps anymore. And so for me, that was him reaching out to his peer group and just saying what kind of angst he was feeling as a result of that situation. I think when I really debriefed with him about the conversations in many of his classes, they weren't discussing it. They did not talk about it. And so I think for me, what I've done is think about 4 things to me that are very important. And so the conversations have to happen. We can't pretend like the students did not see what happened. They see it, they're inundated with it. They need great opportunities to be able to really share their thoughts and feelings. And so as educators, I feel like the first thing we have to do is check our hearts as educators, check some of our baggage at the door, check your views at the door. When you are ready to have those conversations, being neutral, making sure that things are fact-centric, but allowing students to express how they feel, but you being that actual mediator. So checking our hearts, and then second, just being open to actually allowing the conversations to happen. 3, if you're having those conversations, really setting some good ground rules to ensure that there's a safe space. Respect of person, making sure that they understand it's okay to disagree, but we're disagreeing with ideas or content, not with people. And then helping them to really use one of my favorite principles by Stephen Covey: seek first to understand, then to be understood. And then lastly, actually having the conversation and understanding that it might need to be ongoing. And so those are 4 ways that could really help us have a framework for really getting the conversation going within schools. I will end with saying that I feel that it is our goal to really make sure that we give students with the tools necessary to engage in meaningful and constructive conversations. That is one of the best gifts that we can actually give our next generation.
So I'm Angela Cusack again from Vance County Public Schools. We're a rural school district on the urban fringe of Henderson, North Carolina, a little north of Wake County, Franklin County, and Granville. And we have about 5,000 students that we serve, students that are predominantly Black and brown. But of course, we're in a district where it's very important for us to educate all students and make sure that they are ready for this world and what we are experiencing right now. We have a responsibility not only to make sure that they're ready to be a part of the Henderson community, but that they're ready to go out into this world and have these real conversations at a global perspective. And so, you know, listening to Dr. Townsend, she talked about her student, her high school student. I have a college student. And it's important that we make sure at every single level that we're providing the information that is necessary, that is factual, and that we're creating the spaces that students are able to have real conversations. We have a responsibility to make sure that that's done. So 3 things that I think are very important. One, you really have to let go of your fear. Don't let it cripple you. So have the courage to have those conversations at every level. While I am a current administrative intern at the elementary level, I have been a CTE teacher at the high school level, and I have a college student of my own. So making sure that we're prepared to have those conversations, that we're not afraid to step out and talk and just let students freely express. Creating those spaces that allow them to really just share in their feelings and not being afraid to let them speak. But we've created those ground rules. We've set the tone for the room, and we've allowed them to know that we're going to protect them at all costs in those conversations. The second thing that I think is important is to know your students. Relationships really do matter. When you know your students, you know your families, and you know that you are able to have those conversations because they trust you. And so trust is really important when we begin to have these conversations. And we want to make sure that we're doing what is necessary in order for those trust conversations to take place. And the third thing is to really be prepared. Do your research. Don't go into the conversation blind. Make sure that you know exactly what's happening, that you've checked all your bias at the door, that you are able to engage in those conversations and facilitate those conversations in a manner that's unbiased, but a manner that you're able to speak your truth and you stand in authenticity. Back to you, Hiller.
Thank you, Angela. And I also wanted to mention that Angela is a former teacher, and she was Teacher of the Year at Vance County last year. So congratulations, Angela. Thank you so much for your insights. Next, we have Marlon Jones. And Marlon, you're a social studies teacher with ample experience facilitating challenging conversations. I'm wondering if you can speak to all educators, those in social studies classrooms and those with other roles, about what does teaching require of us in this moment?
Well, I would say, first of all, Hillary, thank you for having me. I think one of the things that I have learned in the last 23 or so years in teaching is that the role of teachers is getting ever so increasing with responsibilities. It is our job to shepherd kids through these traumatic experiences. There's no playbook. There's no magic wand that you go to. You have to kind of figure it out. And what I appreciate from the Friday Institute is you bringing us together to have these conversations to support teachers. It is a difficult time for everyone. What it's like in the classroom, it is as difficult as it's ever been, I would say, particularly with virtual. I think it's probably a lot easier to have these type of conversations when we're face to face, but becomes increasingly more difficult because you can't see the kids. I can't see the reactions on their faces. I can't see how to support their emotions all the time. So that becomes very difficult. I do have, I would say, some things that I think will help teachers, or at least they help me. One, I would say, first of all, teachers need to process their own emotions first. You cannot go into the classroom until you know how you feel, and if you're able to articulate your own feelings in a way that are supportive and can help students. if you can't even have the conversation without getting upset, you're not going to be in a position to help your students. Two, I would say one of the things that helped me is having an educational support team around you. So whether that's your professional learning community, whether that's your best friend who's been teaching, whether that's a colleague at another school, you have to be able to talk about what types of things you want to do in the classroom. And what do I mean by that? So the day that this happened, I called my best friend that I've known for over 20 years that teaches middle school. And the first question I asked her is, what are you going to teach tomorrow? I'm not sure. And she said, I'm not sure either, Marlon. I was going to call you. And so what we did in that moment is we began to reach out to our other colleagues. I began to text my department. I had a phone conference with my PLT leader, and we were able to talk through how to address this. And what it did, a couple things it did for me. First of all, it let me know I was not alone. Everyone else was having the same thoughts and feelings that I was having. Number two, it also helped me get other ideas, that I was not the only one to have to come up with the ideas about how to support my students. It really was. And so what happened is that I had about 20 or 30 people working on this problem that afternoon. And so by the time I woke up Thursday morning, not only did I have my lesson plan, I had several other lesson plans that I was able to look at, and I was able to pull the best, or what I thought was the best, out of each lesson plan and use that in my classroom. So I think that was powerful, that it became a team effort and not just Marlon doing it. The other thing I would say is that you have to focus on relationships. You have to focus on building relationships with students from the beginning. What do I mean by that? If you haven't taken the time to get to know your students, and I think Dr. Townsend mentioned this, you're going to have a hard time trying to have a conversation with them, because you're not going to know how they're going to respond to the stimuli. You're not going to know what to expect. And I think that's a recipe for disaster. So I think when you spend time getting to know your students, then you know them, you know who's going to have a negative reaction, you know who's going to possibly say something that may be inappropriate. You're going to be able to know how to respond to that. I always, I think it was Mrs. Cusack talked about plan. Well, that's the way you plan, is you sort of in your head, you figure out, now when I present this, how will my students respond? When I say this, what are they going to say in response? So that way you're kind of prepared for just about anything. Some people call it the unexpected response. Well, you knew you were dealing with a tough issue before you went in the room. So you knew you were going to get responses that you were not necessarily comfortable with, but you got to have a plan. That's about creating that safe space for students, because you can't allow, even when a student disagrees, and even when they have another point of view, you can't allow them to throw what I call the firebomb and destroy the safety of the classroom, and then expect that you're going to be able to support students. So you have to be able to navigate those things. And I think the only way you can navigate those things is by having the relationship with your students. The other thing that I would say that I would like to share is, what did I do specifically with my students on that day? And I think this is helpful because it will give teachers some real live tested lesson plans on that day. So the first thing I did on that day is that we went to the National Archives and we read what the Constitution said about what was supposed to happen on January 6th, and what powers who had and what they could and could not do. I wanted kids to know they didn't have to hear from someone else what was supposed to happen. I wanted them to see it for themselves so that they could make their own conclusions without necessarily say, well, this is what Mr. Jones said. No, this is what we read in the Constitution during that time period. Next, I think we had to spend some time then giving the kids an opportunity to talk about how they felt. So what I did was I showed some images, some of them tough, from the Capitol. This was created by one of my colleagues. And we just talked about, hey, what do you see? What do you notice? And then how do you feel? And so it gave them an avenue to speak if they wanted to. Some people wrote in the chat. Some people talked out loud. It just gave them an opportunity to say how they were feeling, how they were hurt, how they were disturbed. And yes, they brought up some controversial issues that everybody didn't like. One of the students brought up, well, how could we have this happen on the Capitol? Look at what we saw with the Black Lives Matter marches. That came up in the classroom. I had to be there to deal with it. I had to be there to handle those issues. But what I appreciated is, as we went through the day, I got several emails from parents and from students, and they appreciated how I had set up the classroom. And so let me stay focused here. So after we went through how they felt, then we did historical references to tension in American history. So what happened in 1814 with the burning of the Capitol? What happened in 1861 with Lincoln's inaugural address, and some states had seceded from the Union. We went through the historical events of violent aspects on the Capitol grounds. And we also talked about, and we revisited Wilmington 1898 to talk about what happened there. So this was able to give them some historical knowledge and some historical precedent about tension in the country during this time period. And then finally, what we did was we read current responses from world leaders. I thought it was important for our students to see what other countries are saying about us. And I reminded them, you know, we are the world leader. We are the democratic leader of the world. So when people see us having problems, it rocks the rest of the world. And that's what happened there. The biggest thing I would say that I want to leave with teachers is you want to give, I think Mrs. Cusack and Dr. Townsend, you want to give as much factual information as possible. You want to speak much truth to power. I would disagree when I say be neutral, because I don't want to be neutral. I don't want kids to leave the classroom with the sense that I agree with everything that they said. And I don't necessarily do that. And we can agree to disagree, but I really want to push back sometimes on certain things. I want to push back on, well, there was violence in the Black Lives Matter, so why would we be concerned about this violence here? You know, I had to push back on that a little bit from a couple of my students, and we talked about it. Some of them stayed after, but I wanted them to understand the Capitol grounds are sacred to us. They represent the seat of democracy for us. And I also wanted them to understand is nobody supports violence. Nobody supports looting. None of that under any circumstances is supported. And so I wanted them to understand that as well. So I would say the biggest thing, in addition to all those things that I just shared that teachers can do, is you always want to be supportive. You always want to be encouraging. And you always want your students to know that you're in their corner. And I think you'll do fine. Back to you, Hillary.
Thank you, Marlon. We appreciate your insights there. Next, we have Dr. Manfra. Megan, you're a social studies associate professor in the College of Education. What role do you think higher education has and should play in preparing educators to be able to have these difficult conversations?
Yeah, thank you, Hiller, and thank you to my panelists. So I'm humbled to be a part of this panel and to follow such great educators. Of course, Marlon is the Social Studies Teacher of the Year here in North Carolina for good reason, and a proud graduate of our program. So what I did in the days after is actually call my teacher friends like Marlon and ask them what they did. And I think in our role as an associate professor here in the College of Education, as a social studies researcher, I can help provide a little bit of the context for how we talk about issues like this in the classroom. First, though, I think perhaps the most obvious point that's sort of implied here by this panel is that we should talk with students about contemporary issues. The question is, how do we do it? So research suggests that students are deeply interested in these issues. Marlon's example from his classroom suggests, I mean, these issues are highly relevant to their lives. And as Latricia and Angela mentioned, they're looking to us for examples. They're looking to the adults. However, at the same time, we know that there's been a well-documented chilling effect in American classrooms that's hampered the teaching of political issues. This may be due to sort of perceived pressure from administrators to steer clear of these, a fear of angering parents, and then, of course, too, a lack of information and content knowledge and resources. What I really appreciated what the panelists said so far, though, is like in all things in education, it's really important to have a good plan in place. Unfortunately, these events keep occurring. And so if we have a plan for addressing them, then our students know how to know that we have protocols in place that we'll follow. And I really appreciated how Angela mentioned, for instance, having ground rules and trust. As Marlon mentioned, developing relationships with students. So the two big questions for me to answer Hiller's question is what's the proper role of politics in the classroom? And then how do we really navigate this within the kind of complex information system in which we're currently living. Well, we've all heard that adage that you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics, right? So what do you, if you think about that idea that you're not allowed to talk about religion or politics, what does that do? It sort of essentially places political discourse on the fringes, right? It ensures that our political views will only be expressed within a secure bubble. We never have to talk to people who have different opinions. And this has been really well documented in a book by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort. But in our professional development, teacher education courses here, we urge teachers to reconsider the way we discuss politics. There are choices, and as Marlon mentioned, one choice would be to be completely neutral, to either not introduce topics, or when you do, to not really share your own political perspective with students, to kind of play the devil's advocate. However, I think what we lean towards, though, is something that Thomas Kelly refers to as committed impartiality. So what's committed impartiality? It's the idea that from this perspective, teachers can state rather than conceal their own views, not to convince students, but to really model authenticity, to acknowledge that politics are a regular, acceptable part of our lives. However, with committed impartiality, we also want to guide students through fair and open discussion of competing perspectives. And so kind of the example that we heard from Marlon's classroom provides one example of that, looking at a variety of resources and debriefing and engaging students in really systematic reflection. So at the same time, kind of the water we're swimming in right now, though, is this unprecedented access to information. Sometimes this is great. You can go to the National Archives and pull down the Constitution. How many people looked up this 25th Amendment this past week on their smartphone, for example? But at the same time, we know that misinformation played a huge role in this event, and also in the way our students may be interpreting this. And of course, with the advent of social media, it's even easier for us to retreat to our echo chamber or search bubble. And our teens are in the thick of this. As our panelists mentioned, they're almost constantly online. So according to Pew, about 95% of teens have access to smartphones, 45% report that they're online almost constantly. And where do they go for their information? Mainly to places like YouTube, Instagram, or Snapchat. They're not on Facebook, you're right, as much anymore. And so at the same time, our research demonstrates that high school students and college students have a really difficult time evaluating digital sources on the internet. They fail often to identify misinformation. For example, they get distracted by paid content or numerical data or graphs. And then even more striking is evidence of youth radicalization online. If you haven't seen it, I recommend Teaching Tolerance's Miseducation of Dylan Roof as a case study for the radicalization that can occur when children and students begin to go down sort of an algorithmic rabbit hole online. So we're confronting so much as teachers, of course, and this goes in many ways beyond just media literacy. However, I think we can begin to sort of chip away with this through media literacy, including helping students engage in what we call digital forensics, like beginning to do a reverse image search or read laterally. It might be helpful for us as well as educators to even introduce students to news sources that publish a journalism ethics page. And in the chat box, I actually shared a free professional learning resource for teachers that we developed here at the FI about teaching media literacy. So anyway, sort of to wrap up, I think it's considering the role of politics in the classroom, and then to think about the necessity of teaching media literacy alongside this engagement in teaching about controversial issues in the classroom.
Thank you, Megan. We appreciate your insights, and thank you for the resources. We'll make sure we make those available to everyone. Thank you all to our panelists for giving your perspectives from your points of view from where you are living now. We think that that's very valuable. I would like to pose a question, and this can be for anyone on the panel, to go a little bit deeper, you know, we titled this session "Responding to Insurrection," but we do know that wound up in the act of insurrection, there are a lot of other variables, and you've alluded to some of those. I was wondering how, as educators, or do you talk about, related to this topic, do you talk about racism, anti-racism, and white privilege as wound up in the act of insurrection? And if so, how do you broach those topics?
Hiller, I'll share with you what I'm doing in the classroom. So a couple things that I have changed over the years, and one is I'm no longer neutral on this issue of race. Why am I no longer neutral? Because the minority students are looking for me to be a voice. And so I can no longer play that neutral role. And when we see racism, I have to identify it. And I do admit some of you may disagree. So I give kids some room that you may disagree with me, but I'm going to share with you historical examples. I'm going to share with you personal examples, because right now, students, I find, particularly students of color, feel like they don't have a voice in the classroom, that they're isolated, that no one speaks for them. And so I've learned that I have to, it's an uncomfortable role because I still want to support my other students, but I have to learn that I have to sort of get in that space and support them. The other thing that I'm doing in my classroom is that I'm focused on what I guess the experts call culturally responsive teaching. So the things that I teach need to reflect the students in the room. So that means at every point or at some point as we go through a unit, students need to see something related to them. They need to see someone that looks like them. They need to see something that they can identify with. And so I've been working on that to sort of deal with those issues. So I may not call it white privilege. That's a loaded word. And parents may be offended with that word. So I may not use that word, but I am sort of getting at that issue as we look at historical events. And then as we try to connect that to the day. And so I think I'm being somewhat effective. I guess we'll find out at the end of this year, but I've made a concerted effort to try to do some things like that.
Okay, thank you, Marlon. I appreciate that. Related to what you just mentioned, Katie Noblet in the chat has a question staying with this topic. How do you have these conversations with students without offending a parent and their political views, especially if the parent doesn't want their child discussing these things? Like, can we get down to the nitty gritty? Like, how do you handle that? Angela, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Hiller. So thank you, Katie, for your question. I think it's really important, again, when we talk about those relationships, and if parents don't want their scholars having these conversations in the classrooms, there are ways that we can still incorporate these types of conversations. So as a CTE teacher, I taught video design. It was really important. Racism is not new. It is something that has been around for a while. And so a few years ago, there was an incident that happened at my school where a student was voicing their thoughts and their views, and other students felt a certain type of way. And I had to figure out, without offending parents, without offending colleagues, how do we have this conversation? How do we allow our students to have these discussions? And so I used my classroom, the video design classroom, as a platform for my students to learn how to record from different angles and piece together different information. So I love what Dr. Manfra put out in regards to the media literacy, being able to decipher information. We used exactly what Mr. Jones said. We allowed the students to do some research. We created a space for them to come to the table and have real discussions about racism. We brought in, I reached out to other colleagues across the school to see which students that they felt would be great to sit at that table. But it was a collaborative experience where my students were able to learn how to record from different angles, how to moderate these tough conversations. And we brought in professionals. I brought in a student, a law student at North Carolina Central University. I brought in an attorney, a diversity and inclusion attorney. And we were able to have those conversations and no parents were offended. But it's in the manner that you actually have these conversations. And sometimes parents are offended because they feel as if we're trying to push our agenda on their kids. And the reality of it is we want to allow kids a space to have these conversations, because when they go into the real world, what's generally going to happen if we don't teach them now, we have a responsibility to educate them. If we don't teach them now, they get into the real world and they don't know how to respond. They don't know how to check their emotions. And then we see things that we saw recently.
Thank you, Angela. Another question from the chat is from Joe Bask. And Joe is curious about the narrative that the widespread voter fraud and what that played in this insurrection. How did some of you deal with that, with talking with your colleagues and with students?
Well, I guess I would just lead off by saying that, of course, the widespread voter fraud was one of many examples of the great polarization and misinformation that contributed perhaps to this event. Although I think now that we've had some time to really kind of study what occurred, we have more information about some of the actors and their motives in the event. But certainly what we're dealing with is this great deal of misinformation and polarization, and it's very difficult to bring people together if they have their own facts and ideas. And so one of the things that I find very kind of fascinating and important for us to watch is we've seen many of the mainstream social media platforms begin to, shut down some of this conversation, but then that's moved to other platforms, like you've heard of Parler. So what is that going to do when it kind of further takes it out of the public sphere? Are there other ways perhaps that we can monitor social media? Many people have talked about reforms on social media that, like, for example, mainstream newspapers, which face liability if they publish something that's infactual, or is there ways to develop sort of similar types of regulations around social media? So I just kind of put that out there, but it's certainly, you're right to address the fact that there was a very, I think it was something like 45% of people in the US who were convinced that the election had been stolen. So it was very strong, almost 50% divide.
Right. And related to that, Joe also said, so, if people have a set of facts and they think that the election was stolen, then, we might call, some people might call this an insurrection, or these are insurrectionists, and then others might call these people patriots. So how do you manage that when you're talking with students?
I'll take that one. And that's a tough one. What I would say is a couple things. Number one, and it sort of relates a little bit to Megan's answer, I think you have to push back a little bit when students give you things that are not factual. You have to give them some other sources of information for them to consider. But I think you also have to give them the room to consider it. Where I'm not here to make them think like I think or even believe what I believe when our conversation is over. What I'm really here to do is to give them some more information to think about. And so when I approach kids, and I had some that disagree, my whole goal is, hey, well, won't you consider some of these sources over here? Won't you consider the fact that there were like 52 cases where the courts threw out the claims of voter fraud? Won't you consider some things like that? Won't you consider some other sources of information? Because what you don't want to do, and I think this goes to what Mrs. Cusack said, you don't want to offend the parent. You don't want them to go home, because if they go home and tell the parent that you insisted that they believe something, you probably lost ground with them. But if you send them home with information that they to consider, you may just get them to consider it, and possibly over time, get them to consider some other things that may change their mind. Because you're not here. The delicate balance is you don't want to basically send a child home so they can tell their parent they're wrong. You don't want that conversation. That's where you get into trouble with parents. So you want to try to avoid that if you can.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying also what Angela said earlier. It's the manner in which you broach these topics. It's the manner. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if also this goes to kind of an accounting of where the rhetoric comes from. So this question about whether or not it was insurrection or, if all of this entire dialogue or discourse around election fraud really came from the incumbent president, from President Trump. And so he's the one who not only is furthering that discourse, but also seems to have perpetrated or encouraged this insurrection. So shouldn't we also kind of think about the way in which we may need to go back and look at the chain of events and where the information is coming from? Certainly none of the mainstream news sources were embracing that, the notion of a stolen election, for example.
Right.
And can I add to that, Hillary? One other thing I would say is that's where we teach kids about bias. What might motivate a person to say the election was stolen? Well, possibly the losing side might be motivated to say it was stolen because they didn't win. So I think as we teach kids how to analyze documents, I think that was brought up, or at least I wanted to bring that up earlier when you talked to one of the other questions, is the curriculum and documents are always your friend. Use the curriculum and historical documents to teach the things that you want to teach. Don't try to bring things in that are not in your curriculum, because that's where parents take exception to. That's when you're going to get in trouble with the administration. So you want to use those things to offer kids other points of view.
Thank you so much. Gary Blank has a question. What do we say if students wear MAGA hats into our classroom? Do we probe what they mean by that? Do we ban such visual cues? If so, what about Black Lives Matter hats? Any thoughts on that?
So I'll jump in here and just say, I think it's important to make sure that prior to any of this, that you have a specific space for your own classroom. So for me, making sure that you're able to express who you are, and teaching my students that love covers. So as a teacher, a lot of the times we see, hey, I just want to teach curriculum, but I have to teach you how to be a good human. So if you're coming into my classroom, you're probably not going to have on a MAGA hat. You're probably not going to have on a Black Lives Matter hat, because I'm teaching you how to respect the space that we're in. And the space is specific to educating students. And so that's my take.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Jump in. I think it really harkens back to what many of us said, which was really about relationships and setting ground rules. And so being very clear about what your expectations are up front, and then being consistent. And I think that's what students crave, that consistency. So if you would allow one thing and then another and not allow the other, it gets you in trouble. And so for me, it is really about establishing ground rules and then being consistent across the board.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah Hammond has a question. How can educators tend to the trauma and emotional fatigue students are facing in this climate? And I might also add, how can you attend to that while you're also attending to your own emotional fatigue?
Hillary, I guess since my mic's open, I'll give it a shot. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I think you have to let students know, number one, that you're there, you understand, you can empathize, you're going to support them. It's going to be hard. You're having a hard day. I think you have to just be real with students. You have to, in the old days, we'd hug them if they were crying, but you can't do that now in the COVID. But you just really, I think it's again about those relationships. If kids know that you are in their corner, no matter what, they are more likely to be okay when they know they have that support. You talked about the MAGA hats and all of that. I think again, it's about, as they said, relationships, whether it's trauma, whatever the issue is. If kids know that you're going to support them, that you're going to be in their corner, then they will be better. And the same thing with you and your classmates. I mean, you're in the colleagues. I think colleagues have to have a support mechanism around them to help them through. You can't do this by yourself. You can't decide that I'm going to be a one woman or one man show and it's all on me. You're going to burn out. So you have to have a lot of support. You have to have, for colleagues in particular, you have to have some place to vent when you're just on that day in particular. Before we started doing lesson plans, we just talked about how we felt. And so that was a way of allowing us to let it go and then focus. And so that's what I would say. I'm not sure that's the answer they were looking for, but that's what I got.
Well, we know that we've had, even since COVID, we've had so much more emphasis on social and emotional learning, I think, within our schools. And I think that that is mounting even as we continue. So I think overall, educators are more astute about supporting students. And I think that's just going to continue to grow. I think before COVID started, we certainly were focusing on social and emotional support, but I think after COVID, with the different challenges and now continuing challenges, I think it's brought it into focus more for educators. At least that's what we're hearing from educators across the state. Okay. All right, here's one for you. In what ways might the racial and or ethnic identity of an educator impact one's ability and approach to hold conversations with students on the insurrection? How can school leaders support racially and ethnically diverse educators in holding these conversations with their students? There's some assumptions in that question, so you might want to even challenge some of the assumptions. Anybody want to jump in?
That's a lot there. I think the assumption is that if you are a teacher of color, you're going to have some difficulty addressing these issues. Here's my own personal experience. One, what conversation are you trying to have and why you're trying to have it? Is it related to your curriculum? Is it related to your job function? Okay. I think if it's related to your job function, you're so much on a safer ground. I think the problem occurs is if you're in an area that's not really related to what you've been hired to do and you're trying to have those conversations. I think in that case, you need a mentoring group. You know, you need to be working it from a different angle. I think sometimes we think the only way to work an issue is through the classroom, and that's just not necessarily the case. I think a lot of angles and a lot of things that you're trying to do can be from a club or from another position in the school, as opposed to always through the classroom. But in the end, if you've checked your curriculum and this is part of your curriculum, I think you need to fill out your administration first. I'd be careful about going down a road that you already know you're not going to get support for. I think you're setting yourselves up for a headache that you may not be able to win. So you just want to know your environment. Know if you step out here, will you get support from administrators? I've worked for some administrators, been very supportive. I've worked for others that are not. And I have to know what I'm getting myself into. How far am I willing to go before I start? And so I would make that suggestion there. And I think you'll be on safer ground than just jumping out there and having the discussion.
Thank you.
I think I would build on that a little bit is that this, one of the resources that was shared with me is Beyond the Stoplight. And I think Marlon's group at the high school also used this. And so I'll share it with y'all. But one of the things that the author says, and I think it's really important, is that really incumbent on white teachers in particular to have these talks, that we can't rely on our Black colleagues to be the ones who are doing this on their own, and that white teachers every time need to be the one who step up and have these conversations. And if we're engaging in these conversations with students of color, it's very important for us to have our relationships in place with those students, have good information and a real plan for engaging in those conversations. So I think it's a really important question. We've been getting so many good questions that just point to the complexity of these issues that we're facing in the classroom. But again, I mean, I think I would just really reiterate that just the importance of being very thoughtful about the types of conversations we're having, and that it's not isolated, that it is something that is sort of widespread support throughout the school.
And Hiller, if I can also just jump in here and add one thing, I think it's really important that the administration listens to teachers, that we allow teachers to come to the table, to become a part of the conversation and create that framework that we are going to go back into our classrooms and have these conversations with our scholars, and that the conversations are consistent across the board. I like what Marlon said about being able to challenge different things, but we do want to make sure that the basis, the foundation of the conversations are the same for all teachers, and that's regardless of your race.
Very good point. Thank you so much. We have a question. It was put in the chat earlier, and then Sarah Bassell is repeating that question. Any ideas or thoughts on how to help make the conversations developmentally appropriate for younger students? I think about my situation now. I have a son, he's 20 years old, and he's in the house with us. I mean, it's a lot easier for me to talk with him if I had younger students or younger children, or if you have younger children in the classroom that you're teaching. You know, it's a different, it's a whole different area. So any advice for developmental appropriateness for younger students?
I'll jump in here. So after everything that happened last week, I reached out to my nephew, who's 9 years old, and I asked my nephew some questions, you know, and I wanted to know, as educators, we sometimes pretend that we have it all together, but I wanted to know from my nephew, who's 9 years old, tell me, how would you like to have these conversations? What did you learn from this event? And my nephew shared this information, and he said, one thing I want everybody to know is that small kids listen to politics as well. And so I said, you know, so where would you want this introduced? And he said, in the morning meeting. And it made me think about feeling friends. It made me think about how we have these conversations on, how are you feeling today? That's a great place when we think about age appropriateness and introducing these conversations. Big things are happening in the world. How are you feeling? Just starting with a question to touch on your feelings.
Okay, very practical advice. Thank you, Angela. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I would just recommend that Anti-Defamation League has some really good resources for talking about issues with younger students and what's developmentally appropriate. For instance, what type of images may not be as appropriate in the classroom and things. One thing that I just want to reiterate is role plays or simulations are never appropriate in any of these situations. Perhaps picture books or children's literature, much easier ways to bring about these stories and these narratives into the classroom.
Thank you so much. Robert Coven has a question, and it really goes to, we've been talking a lot about the social studies context, and probably social studies teachers might be thinking more about some of these issues and, you know, have a lot of background more so than some other teachers. But, you know, really we all need to be able to do this. How can we support teachers across disciplines to be prepared to have these conversations?
I would say it's really important that we reach out to our colleagues and And like Marlon said earlier, that we don't think that we have to do it alone.
Mhm.
We have a community, a support system. We have student behavioral health teams. We have experts in different areas. Reach out to those that you need. If you're researching and you don't understand something, or you have more questions, reach out to the professionals. I think that's okay.
Great. Thank you, Angela.
And then I'll jump in.
Mhm.
I think we've said this time and time again, it's really about the relationships that we build with our students. And so I think that leaves it open to have some of these conversations in other spaces. I can speak to my son. They were able to have a really good discussion through their homeroom. And so they had built a system of community within that particular setting that enabled them to have real conversation about the issue. And I think it goes back to what you said, Angela. I said, whether they're 9 years old or you're looking at my 14-year-old, they are interested in people knowing how they feel. And so just speaking about some of that and just getting that out on the table and providing a forum for students to have a space to connect. But again, still those ground rules, making sure that it is done in a way that everyone's thoughts and experiences can be honored. So.
Can I jump in there? I think that's a great point Dr. Townsend made about using another avenue. So homeroom, that's another avenue to have this conversation. That's another avenue to build relationships with kids. That's another avenue. So I think that's a great way to do that. The only other thing that I would offer is when I first started teaching both middle school and high school, I used to do cross-curricular items with teachers. And I think when you figure out what it is that you're trying to do, maybe you go to another teacher to say, how can we do this together? What can you do in your classroom and what can I do in my classroom? So that then the kids are hearing it in the same, from different teachers, but from the same team of teachers. That would be a good way, I would say, to also work with teachers that are not social studies.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We just have a couple of minutes left. I was wondering if I could just ask each one of you to think about our conversation today and maybe just give a really short point that you'd like to make sure that our audience remembers. So 1 point, suggestion, advice, or principle that you'd like to put forth before we sign off today. And I'll start with Megan. Do you have one idea? And then we'll just go around.
Sure. I think that one of the things that really came out here is engaging the full community, not just the teacher with the individual students in the classroom, but also across departments and with parents and everyone who's engaged in educating students in these conversations.
Letitia?
Okay, so I'm just going to say relationships, making sure that the relationships are being built initially so that when you have to really start withdrawing some of that emotional currency, you're able to, you've created a safe space. So relationships has to be my word.
Thank you so much. We have about 30 seconds left. Angela?
I'm going to go with culture and making sure that the values in our classrooms are succinct and that we let our students know that just being a good human is really important. And if they don't take anything else, be kind.
Thank you. Marlon, one last word?
Engagement. We have to engage not only our students, but we got to teach them how to engage the world around them. That's the only way we're going to have a successful democracy.
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you've heard this dialogue and you've heard some ideas that were going to be helpful for you as you navigate these difficult times that we're in, both personally and professionally. So we appreciate everyone, and we hope that we'll all continue to learn and to probe and be the best selves that we can be as educators. We're going to have a recording of this session. It's going to be available on our website and through social media shortly. So if you want to push that out to others, feel free to do so. Thank you all for joining us, and please, everyone, be safe.